My favorite indie comic book of all time is finally back with another issue, and I wouldn't be exaggerating if I said that this series just keeps on getting better and better.
Peak fiction incoming.
With that being said, in the last issue of Rook Exodus, we saw Rook going on a long and gruesome journey across some dangerous snow-covered mountains because he wanted to recruit a warden named Matterhorn, who was also searching for the world engine just like him and his team. And although initially Matterhorn was skeptical if trusting Rook was a good idea, eventually she caved in and agreed to join his side because she was worried about Donica upon finding out that she was in pursuit of her father Bloodhound because she knew that he was incredibly dangerous thanks to a previous exchange where he killed her entire team. So her and Rook tried catching up to Donica before things with her father could get out of hand, but unfortunately they weren't able to get there fast enough, allowing Bloodhound to provoke a battle between him and Donica. But somewhere amidst the chaos while their animals were clashing against each other, the battle was ended prematurely when a massive access hatch opened up beneath their feet, causing Bloodhound to take a massive plummet into a giant underground facility, where it's then revealed that the person who opened the access hatch was none other than a warden named Arachnid, who was in control of the spiders. This issue, on the other hand, picks up as Rook and Matterhorn finally come to Donica's aid, but while observing the access hatch that Bloodhound fell inside, Rook began worrying about the well-being of their animals, expressing that the leader of his flock, Poe, along with Pumbaa and the other animals, desperately wanted to go someplace where it was warmer, but instead they chose to stay with their wardens because they knew that sacrifices had to be made in order to save the planet. Nevertheless, moments later, Matterhorn began doubting that they would ever be able to fix the world engine because on top of not being able to find the main engine room despite looking for it for the past few weeks, the only person who knew how to fix it was Bloodhound, and even if his mind wasn't such a mess, he was probably dead now after plummeting into the access hatch. After hearing this though, and coming to terms with the fact that her father might be dead, Donica was visibly upset and Rook took notice right away. So in hopes of restoring her faith and keeping her spirits up, Rook would then confidently state that Bloodhound was still alive because if he wasn't alive, his birds would be circling over his body. Even if he was alive though, Donica was almost certain that they were gonna fail because after he attacked her with his dogs earlier, she was doubting that restoring his mind was even possible. And that's when Matterhorn began reinforcing her beliefs even more so by stating that Bloodhound's taste for blood was insatiable before describing the very night that he ordered his pack of dogs to slaughter her entire team. Despite the two ladies being so certain that Bloodhound was a lost cause though, Rook was still determined to uplift Donica's spirits even though she claimed that her father didn't even recognize her, stating that because he was wearing his mask, which prevented her from seeing his eyes, she couldn't be certain that he truly didn't remember who she was. After that though, our story gets a little more interesting because upon digging through some of the snow, Matterhorn discovered that they were standing on top of an elevator platform that was big enough for everybody, including their animals. But because it only took a few short seconds to realize that it wasn't responding, she then expressed that their only realistic shot at reaching the bottom of the hatch was by utilizing climbing gear to rappel themselves inside. But before that would take place, Rook would then take one last moment to pull Donica aside to give her some words of encouragement, expressing that she once convinced him to stand his ground and fight, so giving up right now should be the last thing on her mind. Nevertheless, as the three wardens began repelling into the dark abyss, we're then given some little narration boxes where Rook explains that because Pumbaa, the goats, and the wolves obviously couldn't fly, he was forced to part ways with some of his birds so they could guide the animals to a different access hatch on the other side of the mountain. Once they finally reached the bottom and realized that the power was out, Rook began saying that it was probably because of Better World pulling the plug after the events of the world engine failing, but according to Matterhorn, he couldn't have been more wrong because there were actually thousands of solar batteries inside, which meant that somebody was purposely keeping the lights off. Nevertheless, because of how deep into the ground they were, Donica would then express that the wildlife grid was out of range, so pinpointing her father's whereabouts wasn't a possibility. But assuring her that that wasn't a problem, Rook would then imply that he was confident in his bird's ability to lead the way. As they continued searching for the room that controlled the power though, one of Rook's crows started panicking because it got tangled up in a spider web that was covering up the entrance of a tunnel. So Rook pulled out a knife and quickly cut it free, but immediately after doing so it started flying back up towards the surface because it was scared. Unsure of what caused it to grow so fearful though, the three wardens would then begin walking inside the tunnel only to stop themselves just moments later upon hearing a strange noise. And in addition to them being startled by something, Pumbaa and his fellow animals were also in a fearful situation because they could hear some noises that sounded like howling that weren't too far away. And that's when none other than Bloodhound, who was covered in clusters of spider eggs, came leaping out and attacking Donica at the exact same time that his pack of wild dogs began going after all the animals. So once again, Donica tried getting through to her father and expressing that they needed to get his helmet off, but due to him continuously clawing at her and refusing to cooperate, separate, Matterhorn began running towards him with all the speed that she had until knocking him onto the ground with a headbutt to the chest. But unfortunately, this didn't accomplish much because Bloodhound immediately got back on his feet before retreating into the tunnel. Nevertheless, upon regaining her composure, Donica would then express that Matterhorn was being more aggressive than necessary, stating that they only needed to restrain her father rather than breaking him in half. But Matterhorn was certain that she was doing what was needed, so if Donica really wanted her father's helmet off, then she would stop criticizing the way that she worked. After that though, things began taking yet another turn for the worse, because when Matterhorn noticed something moving on the other side of the tunnel, Rook was overcome by the emotions and instincts of his flock, which were basically telling them that they needed to fly away because something horrible was soon to come. And it turns out that their instincts couldn't have been more right, because on the other side of the tunnel was an absolutely massive spider nest covered in absolutely massive spiders. So Rook instantly cocked his rifle back and started blasting as many of them as he could, while Matterhorn expressed that they needed to get out of there as soon as possible by heading back into the tunnel. But despite the fact that her father just finished attacking her, Donica just couldn't pull herself to leave him behind, so she grabbed him by the hand and they ran into the tunnel as Rook continued trying to cut down spiders, but because there was just so freaking many of them, eventually he was overwhelmed. However, as you can see from the battle with all the wolves, goats, Pumbaa, and the dogs, eventually a fifth swarm of animals entered the picture, and those animals were sent by none other than Stag, aka Warden of the Deers. And so as his herd helped Pumbaa and the others cut down Bloodhound's forces, he himself began using his katanas to slice through a bunch of spiders, but it wasn't long before he was redirecting his attention over to Bloodhound by kicking him onto the ground, because if you don't remember, he was actually chasing after Bloodhound in the beginning of last issue, and upon hovering over his body while holding one of his swords to his throat, he then expressed that the reason he wanted Bloodhound dead was because he actually killed his wife. But sadly, that's when this issue comes to an end, but if you guys want to see what happens next, let me know in the comments down below.